Welcome to Prevention is Now. I'm Deb Bonner, preventionist and community advocate for Prairie Center Against Sexual Assault in Springfield, Illinois. Emerging evidence is suggesting that comprehensive consent education could be highly effective in sexual violence prevention. The two most common models of consent taught currently are affirmative consent and welcomeness. In affirmative consent, participants give informed, voluntary, and active consent through words and action to specific sexual acts. The welcomeness model builds on the framework of affirmative consent in that it, too, is informed, enthusiastic, and ongoing. However, it also addresses the fact that consent may be coerced and states that consent is not given if the behavior is not requested or invited and the conduct is offensive or undesirable. So while the idea of consent is straightforward and is taught by those of us in prevention fairly consistently, what the media teaches about consent is diametrically different. What is often portrayed in movies and television, if the idea of consent is even addressed, is no means try harder. Combine that idea with pervasive gender role stereotypes, and we find the messaging the media is sending about consent and sexuality highly problematic. To take a closer look at how the media portrays the idea of consent and sexuality is Dr. Michele Meek. Dr. Meek is an assistant professor in the Communication Studies Department at Bridgewater State University. She has written numerous articles for publications such as Ms. Magazine, Script Magazine, The Good Men Project, and Salon.com. In 2018, Dr. Meek gave a TEDx talk, Why We're Confused About Consent, Rewriting Our Stories of Seduction. Dr. Meek, welcome. So while I think it is easy for most people to recognize the most egregious forms of rape culture in the media, like the rape scenes in Game of Thrones, for example, much of what is in our daily media consumption far more subtle. So what do you think are some of the most harmful messages the media is sending about girls and women, and how are they being disguised?
So I think that one of the harmful things that we're still seeing, it's getting better, I think, is this idea that coercive behavior is still extremely normalized in our culture. And so that creates a situation where affirmative consent, is supposed to be getting rid of the fact that people are having encounters that they don't want. But if we're thinking about two people together and one is using all these different, coercive methods to get that person in bed or to get them to do what they want sexually, that's really just, even if that person then says yes, what does that yes even mean? And so we have to think about how consent is invalidated. And I think, one of the films that I write about, The Kissing Booth, I think is a perfect example of this, because the whole idea of the film is this guy that she has, a girl has a crush on a guy, and she doesn't sort of see how coercive his behavior is, how abusive his behavior is. And the film is depicted as this romantic teen comedy where, a girl has a crush on a guy and he likes her back. But the kinds of behavior that he engages in are really damaging. For example, he tells all the boys at school to stay away from her because we don't know why he does that. Does he do that because he's very protective of her, or does he do that because, he wants her for himself? In either case, that's a damaging behavior, and we're supposed to interpret that in the story as romantic. And those kinds of setups, I think, need to start really being called out, and so that we just start seeing them less and less. Because for that to be the plot of a, sort of romantic teen movie in 2018 or 19 is kind of shocking, actually.
Well, and it's interesting because just most recently in the news, we're seeing now that people are being concerned about cartoons with like Pepe Le Pew, the skunk who just cannot take no for an answer. So, and that's very much non-consensual when he's going after the poor kitty all the time. But it's a cartoon. So does that make it better or worse?
I think it's just as bad. I mean, I think that the fact is that we learn about consent through all of these kinds of interactions and all of these kinds of depictions. It's not one single instance where we say, you can't show kids hundreds, dozens of movies and television episodes and all of these things where consent doesn't matter, and then sit them down for an assembly and tell them how important consent is. Like, that doesn't work. You have to show it over a period of time and make that a consistent message that consent is important and we need to respect consent. That means not just we are watching things where consent matters, but also that when kids are interacting with other adults or other kids, I've always been saying to my kids, like, even with each other, he's saying no, she's saying no, he doesn't want to hug, you have to respect that. And I do the same thing with my kids too. So I think it comes from all these types of interactions. So yes, it's just a cartoon, and if you were watching that with your kids, I would say, I would have a conversation about it, because it's not, we aren't just blank slates where everything is being written on by the media. Of course, we can engage with media critically, but we have to actually do that work. And if it's not being engaged with critically, then the message is sort of coming through without that critical engagement, which means that we might be getting the message that it's funny when someone doesn't listen to a no, for example.
In your recent article in Girlhood Studies exposing the flaw of affirmative consent through contemporary American teen films, you talk about the shift from films in the 80s, which overtly promote rape culture, like the various Porky's films, and why there was more than one of those, I really don't know, or Revenge of the Nerds, Weird Science, 16 Candles, to movies that encourage consent cultures, citing examples like Good Boys, Premature, and Booksmart. What are the significant changes that we are seeing regarding sexual violence and consent that you have seen?
So I think that teen movies in, the 2010s and now the 2020s certainly are trying to take consent into account more and more. Absolutely. On the surface, at least. That said, what I'm noticing is that there's a good deal of non-consent still in these stories. For example, the film Good Boys, the whole premise of Good Boys is based on non-consent. It's a bunch of pre-teenage boys who want to learn about sex, and so they, without the consent of a parent, take one of their father's drones and use it to spy on teenage girls who live next door, so that they can learn about, sexual interactions and romantic relationships from these girls, again, without their consent. So the whole premise of the plot is non-consent. So when the film then engages with consent on these other levels, like the joke of the boys practicing on what they think is a CPR doll, but is actually a sex doll, and then one of them says to the other, "Oh, you can't kiss her without your consent, remember assembly." Affirmative consent is sort of part of the conversation in the film, but the whole narrative is about non-consent in a way. And so I think it's funny, we're in this weird period where I think there's a lot more conscious attention to getting consent in those moments of sexual interaction, whereas the overall plots are still sometimes, I'm sort of scratching my head, even in a film like Booksmart, which is, sort of positioned as a feminist film, and in one of the sex scenes, consent is very much part of the conversation between these two girls who are sort of figuring it out. But we also see a scene where the two girls are given drugs without their consent. And that's not really shown as much of a problem as it really is. To give someone drugs without their consent is, I'm sure, illegal. I certainly hope so, right? So those are the kinds of things that still sort of slip through the narrative in a way that seems like, shouldn't this be shown as a little bit more problematic? That said, of course, teen films are not necessarily showing us ideal behavior. But I think that, again, it's about critically engaging with that work and noticing that's not okay. And what do we make of that? How can we talk about that and have conversations about these parts that maybe leave us with more questions than answers?
And that's one of the things you talk about in your TEDx talk, which, by the way, if people have not seen it, they really should, because it is excellent. And you talk about how the behavior leading up to the actual moment where someone is like, okay, we can have sex, we are consenting, that it's all messed up. And you talk about the seduction stories. Is that the flaw in the affirmative consent? And is that it's just not complete, that only that maybe 15, 20 minutes that you're actually having physical sexual contact, that's the only time we really need to worry about consent. Everything else is up for grabs.
I think there's kind of two key problems with the affirmative consent model that we don't often acknowledge, because I think we're also wanting to really solve this issue of non-consent in our culture. And we moved from no means no, which didn't seem inclusive enough, to yes means yes, so that we could acknowledge mostly female desire and agency, right? But there's still a lot left out of the affirmative consent model, unfortunately. And I see sort of a few main things. One is that exactly what you said, that the affirmative consent model puts a lot of importance on that moment of consent, of sexual interaction. So in a film like Kissing Booth, where the boy is doing all this kind of coercive behavior to lead up to this moment, that's really quite shocking and upsetting, actually. But in the moment, he says to her, we don't have to do this, right? And she says, no, I want, it's clear she wants it in the moment. And it excuses all of the other behavior somehow. I think the film is sort of excusing all of the other behavior that leads up to this moment of her saying yes. So that's one of the problems. The other problem is that the idea of consent, we really have to think about what the difference is between what someone says and what someone feels, and what do we mean by consent even? Are we prioritizing what someone says in that moment, or are we prioritizing what someone feels or thinks in that moment? And this is one of the biggest, I think, head scratchers of the whole affirmative consent model, and where we've been heading over the last kind of decade or so, is that we've been prioritizing that if someone says yes and you get a yes, then all clear to go ahead. What do we do with the situations where someone might be saying yes, but not meaning yes, or not feeling yes, or not thinking yes? And that is really a troubling kind of aspect that we often don't acknowledge. So those are really two of the fundamental problems. And then there's a third one, but I know we want to talk about this too, about how boys are treated in the whole affirmative consent model, and they're often ignored.
And not only are boys ignored, because a lot of people don't think, because in the media, it's very often portrayed that guys, I always think back to, there's a line from the sitcom Frasier when Frasier says, how can men use sex to get what they want? Sex is what they want. And that's kind of what we're trained to think by the media, is that men are ready to go anytime you say yes. They're just waiting for permission. And that's not true.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the biggest problems too about the affirmative consent model, is that it tends to be talked about in a highly gendered way, where boys need to be making sure and men need to be making sure that they're getting consent from females, from women or girls, right? And let's be frank, women and girls have been the majority of victims of sexual assault and violence. So there's no accident that this sort of stereotype has come about. That said, boys and men, in fact, are not always and already consenting at all times. You can't presume consent in the other direction either. And there's also, I think that the other problem about this discourse is it tends to be a very heteronormative discourse, where we're just assuming that it's a woman or a girl sort of with a boy or a man. It's not. We have to start to think about, how does consent happen in all of these other kinds of situations, and realizing that consent is something that you encounter on your day-to-day basis in like so many different ways, and kind of making us part of that culture, of a consent culture, while really also recognizing that this is a complex thing, and getting at what people really want and how they feel is not always as easy and apparent as we wish that it could be, to just say that, like, here's the black and white line of what you should and should not do, or should do. And I'm not saying there's a gray area, because I think that that's one of the biggest mistakes that people will sometimes make. Is like, well, no one can know. How can men ever know how to have consent? Like, no, that's not true. I think that the fact is that's why in my TEDx talk, I really talk about this yellow zone, because it's more that we want to be aware and cautious when we're not 100% sure we're getting a clear yes, or what's led up to that yes. those are the times that we want to be really conscious.
In your TEDx talk, that's one of the things I like, because you do look at that as the seduction stories, and maybe that's something we should talk about a little bit more, because seduction can be a couple of different ways in the media, where it's this very romantic kind of leading along and checking in and making sure we're okay at each level. And then there's a very dark form of seduction where there's no consent, and yet it's portrayed as kind of the same thing, that at the end, it's what the woman wanted all along, whether she realized it or not. So it is a challenge.
It is. So I think that, in these kinds of films like 50 Shades of Grey and Twilight, and also the teen film, The Kissing Booth, these male characters are shown to be the protectors against really violent sexual assault. But at the same time, it's easy then to overlook the kinds of coercive and abusive behaviors that these characters themselves are engaging in. For example, in Twilight, he shows up in her room without her consent, watching her sleep. I mean, things like, really, if you just took it out of the context of the movie, is almost so disturbing that you think, how could you ever even make a romantic story around this kind of plot? But somehow we get seduced into believing that this is a character who really loves her and cares about her and wants to protect her. And, there's the trap, right? There's the trap where it suddenly it excuses this whole kind of world of really pretty bad behavior.
Well, I think maybe part of the problem is not only is it giving this really bad representation of what consent is, it's giving a very bad representation of what love is. Because very often what these emotions, he just loves her so much. I mean, this is very toxic. And not only we're just being taught what really bad information about relationships across the board, not only consent, but how we should be expressing ourselves and what really is a healthy relationship. I mean, it's problematic from start to finish.
Yeah. And, these kinds of stories go back so far. I mean, there was a novel years ago, Pamela, and the whole idea of the story was that this girl who was working for this guy, she was like a maid, and he, quote, was attracted to her, wanted her, and she fought off all of these kind of really outrageous advances. And at some point, he even kidnapped her. And then at the end, he asked her to marry him. And the whole plot of the story sort of excuses all of these behaviors that he's done, including kidnapping and attempting to rape her, because ultimately he actually does want to marry her. And so, like, this idea of love that you're talking about, this sort of twisted idea of love, goes so far back in our cultural narrative that I think it's really been hard for us to wake up to seeing those patterns and then learning how to invent stories that don't rely on those patterns, because they just are so baked in. And I know when I work with students on screenwriting, for instance, it's like the first place our mind goes, I think. It's the easy solution to the story or the plot.
A couple of thoughts have occurred to me while we're talking about presentation of women in films and relationships. And do you think part of the problem could be the utter lack of diversity in Hollywood as far as directors go and things like that? Because most of these things are men writing about what women feel. And we have this very pervasive myth that women don't know what they want. They think they want you look at any Hallmark movie, the woman, she's big, she's successful, but she goes to the small town and realizes what she's missing in her life is a man. No, not really. But these are stories that are very typically pushed. And do you think that lack of diversity in Hollywood is just constantly feeding the beast, so to speak?
I think it is, but I also think that women and people of color and queer and non-conforming individuals also can sort of unknowingly or unwittingly buy into some of these patterns. The Kissing Booth actually was written by a 15-year-old girl. It was a book that she wrote in a public, I think it was Wattpad or something, some public platform. It ended up getting picked up as a movie. So I think that the diversification of Hollywood is important and more than important. It's a critical step to having more diversity of stories. And there's no doubt in my mind that women and filmmakers of color and queer filmmakers have been really often at the forefront, and independent filmmakers in general have been at the forefront of kind of helping us reshape some of these narratives to go in a different direction. So I know that that's absolutely critical in order to get more points of view. But, it's not to say that that's the only solution. We also have to become a lot more conscious of how non-consent is sort of baked into a lot of the story ideas that we come up with, to a lot of the types of character situations that we come up with, because they've just been part of our way of storytelling for so many years. It's what we've all grown up with and kind of learned to think about as romance. And so how do we even find our way to stories that don't rely on those kinds of patterns?
And we're starting to see, I think, some of that happen in Hollywood. I mean, you look at movies like The To-Do List. In the 80s, you never would have seen a movie about a woman or a girl who makes a list of sexual conquests and experiences that she wants to have. Are we swinging that pendulum too hard now to say that, yes, women are empowered and they're sexual, but they're still missing the importance of what a healthy relationship is?
Yeah, I really do think that one of the things, and as you know, I've kind of criticized a lot when films just simply do this gender swap thing. Female sexual empowerment, in my opinion, shouldn't come at the expense of male consent. And I think that that's a dangerous trap to get ourselves in. And this is where, again, affirmative consent tends to be a highly gendered discourse where we're really concerning ourselves with the consent and the agency for females and not as much remembering all the time that consent and agency for males is also important. And so, I love all of these movies, I should say, and I really enjoy engaging with them. But, I have yet to see a movie that I've seen where it's really hard to find a movie where there's no problems with it, where I don't say I love that the To-Do List, gives the agency to the girl in this way, but I don't love how she simply starts giving a hand job to a boy in a movie theater without even asking or framing anything around consent about what they're going to be doing. And again, it falls into that trap of just assuming, of course he would want that. And, in fact, the boy character in that film really does want a relationship. Actually, he really likes her. And he thinks that they're moving towards this. He doesn't think of himself. He doesn't realize that he's just a checkbox on a list. And I think anytime we're looking at a movie and we're thinking, if the gender roles were swapped, this would be unacceptable, right? Can you imagine a movie in in the last couple of years being made where a guy goes around checking off conquest with girls on a checklist and we thought that was funny and acceptable? No, that wouldn't happen. So if that can't happen in that way, then it shouldn't really be funny and okay to happen in the other direction as well.
And one of the interesting films that we've seen that really deals with the idea of sexual violence head on in a way that we haven't seen is A Promising Young Woman. It's this rape revenge genre that we've seen, but it's presented in such a different way because you look at something like Taken, or you look at something like the Death Wish movies or things like that, where a woman is assaulted, but the man it's almost his honor. It's a very antiquated idea of I've got to go avenge my daughter or my wife for my honor. We're going to totally forget that she's suffered and that she's experienced this horrible thing, but it's my honor on the line. Yet now we see something like a Promising Young Woman that it's just an entirely different perspective and really kind of shows for the first time, I think, in these kinds of movies, the trauma that's really caused by sexual violence.
There are so many things I love about the movie A Promising Young Woman. I mean, I don't even know where to begin. And I think that one of the things I love the most about it is that it totally turns the rape revenge movie on its head in that way, like you're talking about, but in so many other ways, it doesn't show the sexual assault, right? And rape revenge movies often kind of really depict the sexual assault quite vividly. You think of a movie even like The Accused, where at the end we see explicit the entire sexual assault. And I understand the point of that. To see it is to be impacted by it, to have empathy for the person experiencing it. But at the same time, it's almost like to perpetuate it too a little bit. And so I really appreciated how the film did not use that. And I also really love how the film connects the ideas of this egregious, sexual assault that frames the whole film, which is this gang rape of her friend, but also shows how it's connected to these more like everyday occurrences of a guy taking home a woman who's obviously too intoxicated to consent and thinking that, that's okay. So, I love the kinds of connections that film is making there. And also how it shows the complicity, that it's not just the guy who raped her, it's the men who were there, it's the women who kept it secret, it's the dean who didn't take it seriously enough, it's the lawyer who represented him, it's all of these people who are complicit in upholding a system that fosters and supports and kind of allows for sexual assault and violence to happen and go unpunished.
And I think it's so different in that you look at something like Law and Order SVU, where they deal constantly with the idea of sexual violence, but even in that very raw, gritty way that they try to do it, they really kind of miss the point of how this is for people who experience sexual violence, such an ongoing, impactful thing in their life, because it's not just the time while the assault was happening. It's not just while the investigation is going on or the trial, if indeed that actually happens, because we all know that very rarely does anything actually come to trial, that these people who are survivors have lifelong impacts from these kinds of acts. And so often, I think in Hollywood, by just keeping it confined to these very small, the 2 hour that the movie exists, that people lose how impactful assault is.
Right. I think that, in terms of thinking about sexual assault as a traumatic event, there is just a huge range. And I think that we sometimes mistake in talking about sexual violence and assault as thinking it's this very black and white issue where either we sort of mistake it as something where someone just like gets over, or we mistake it actually for thinking that something someone can't get over, which is also not true a lot of the time. And, I think that some of the interesting work that is being done in media by some filmmakers are kind of targeting some of these ambiguities. Greta Gerwig's film Lady Bird, for instance, has a really disturbing scene where she has intercourse for the first time with a guy who has told her that he was a virgin too. And afterwards, she's just like sitting there trying to think of how to make sense of this experience. Is she a victim as a result of the deception that he sort of perpetrated? Or, as she said in the scene, but I was on top. She drove this interaction. She wanted it to happen. She initiated it. And the fact is, like, it can be both, right? You can both feel victimized by an experience and also have had some level of agency in the experience. I think that this is where those kinds of complicated situations, to be able to show them and think about them and talk about them, are really important, because this isn't an experience that is necessarily going to make her unable to enjoy sex ever in the film, but it's also one that deeply impacts her, and we can see that in the film. And I think some of these more experiences that from talking to women, like I have to say, there's barely any women I've ever talked to that have not experienced some situation that felt like a sexual assault or something that felt really unpleasant that they weren't sure how to make sense of. So this is something that we're all experiencing on some level and have to make sense of. seeing those kinds of depictions that are more in that confusing area, I think are really important for all of us to be able to help make sense of our own experiences too.
Now, you have talked about some movies that kind of get the seduction stories right and consent correct and are a great opportunity, especially as we're watching with kids or with our teenagers or whatever, to create these conversations. What are some of those movies? I put you on the spot, didn't I?
I mean, it is so hard. Because like I said, I love all of these movies. I mean, obviously I love teen movies, or I wouldn't spend so much time watching them and thinking about them and writing about them. So I really do love this genre, but I have to say that, in almost all of them, I look at them and I think there's something to discuss here. Like I said, Booksmart. I mean, such a great, lesbian encounter in that film that is very complex and shows how they're both thinking about consent, but that, things are not kind of going well and it's sort of awkward and uncomfortable. I love that film, but the whole premise of the plot, is that they're trying to get to this party and they won't take them there, and then they're given drugs without their consent. So it's just so hard to find something that unambiguously I would say this is an example of how great, how well consent should work. I think that newer teen films in general are engaging more with this idea. I mean, one of my favorite all-time films still is Dirty Dancing. But again, and I love that she's got so much agency in that story, and that, how it complicates even how male consent is sort of read in that story, because he's with all these older women, but does he, he's sort of being used by them, and that's how he sees it. But again, in today's world, how would that story be viewed? She was younger than him, perhaps over the age of consent, but nonetheless, in a lot of ways, we could look at that story and feel a lot of discomfort about the kind of relationship that was setting up. So, I mean, I literally can't think of a film where I would say unambiguously, I see all the positive, and I have nothing to criticize. But maybe this is just a fact of being in film studies. I'm just looking at things so closely, and it's not to say I don't enjoy it, but I am kind of analyzing it very closely.
But I think that's the important thing that we're getting to, is that while it's fun to sit back and eat your popcorn and watch the movies, it is okay also to go, that's not right. We need to have a conversation about this, about why that's wrong. Do you think Hollywood is ever going to get it right? Or is it just because so much of storytelling is hyperbole? So do you think it's always going to be a problematic issue?
I think that, what I'm seeing is it, as usual, in sort of smaller indie films, some of the most important work being done. I just showed a movie in class the other day called Boy Meets Girl, which was about a transgender girl who is kind of trying to figure out her sexuality. And, consent is definitely a part of that film. And I think there's a lot there that's worth exploring and thinking about. And, a film like that, which did, I don't know, something like not even $100,000 at the box office, is really worth seeing and thinking about. So I feel like, for Hollywood, they're kind of always the last in line to sort of get with the program. I mean, you got to think about the fact in Europe, they were making films about, sort of queer characters long before U.S. independent films, I would say in the 90s, started having queer characters in indie films. And that didn't really happen in Hollywood until very recently. I mean, the movie Love, Simon was 2018. I mean, we're talking about just a couple of years ago. They were maybe it's worth investing in a story about a queer character as the protagonist, So, when you look to the trends, I would say you've got to look towards Europe. You've got to look towards independent films, because they are usually charting the new territory before Hollywood comes around. They are very slow to make changes. They are very risk averse. And even though it might be the way we're going, to have more consent, they're going to be super cautious. in a lot of these ways. And there is a lot of pushback on films now, a lot of public pushback, which can really shut down a film's trajectory. And so they know that they're very risk averse, and they want to make sure that they're creating stories that are not going to be, if they're controversial, that only feeds into the watching of the film, not controversial in a way that people shut it down.
Well, Dr. Meek, we're just about out of time here. I do want to thank you. I could go on and on and on about this topic, and you've got some great links on your website, articles you've written, your TEDx talk, which again, if people have not seen, really should take the 10, 15 minutes to watch it because it is excellent. Where can people find all of your information?
So if you go to michelemeek.com, one L is Michele, so Michele. I have really all of the links to my TEDx talk, my articles that I've written, and, subscribe to updates on my email newsletter. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook, so you can certainly follow me on those places as well.
Thank you so much for taking some time and chatting with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
This has been Prevention is Now. I'm Deb Bonner, preventionist and community advocate for Prairie Center Against Sexual Assault. If you'd like more information or have questions about this program, you may call our offices at 217-744-2560 or send me an email at dbonner@prairiecasa.org. Prairie Center Against Sexual Assault supports children and adult survivors of sexual violence through counseling and legal and medical advocacy in 11 central Illinois counties. Prairie Center offers coaching boys into men for male high school and college athletes, bringing in the bystander training for college campuses and sexual harassment prevention training for businesses and organizations in our area. Our main office is located in Springfield, Illinois, with satellite offices in Jacksonville and Taylorville, Illinois, and you can find out more about our services at our website at prairiecasa.org. This program is supported by a grant from the Illinois Department of Public Health and the Illinois Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Points of view or opinions contained in this program are those of the Prairie Center Against Sexual Assault and our guests and do not necessarily reflect the official positions or policies of these grantors. Thank you for listening.